The History of Western Immoren, Part 3. The Warlord Era. The Warlord Era was the time when the Mennite warrior priests and priest kings had their greatest and most sweeping battles against barbarism. It was a time of savagery and bloodshed, which marked the founding of new city-states and paved the way for the proliferation of fiefdoms and pockets of armed settlements which would define life in Western Immoren for thousands of years. Even the smallest village needed to erect walls against the horrors that came from beyond the torchlight, and prayers to Menoth were seen as providing the only clear path between life and death. In this era, the priest kings of Cilicia and Card tamed the wilds with the rule of law and the judgment of steel. By their example, the true law of civilization became a weapon wielded against the barbaric throngs in service to the devourer worm. Cilicia, Golovant, and the Shield of Thrace. Between the Mulgur, who dominated the mountains of the west and the inhospitable wastes of the Bloodstone Marches, to the east arose a thriving Mennite community. Following the example of Sinat and those who came after, they quickly set about tilling the fertile land and creating dozens of settlements, outposts, and temples. These communities were united under the warrior priest Valent of Thrace around 2800 BR. Drawing workers by the hundreds and hauling lumber across nearby forests and stone from freshly dug quarries, they created the Hold of Cilicia, a great fortress that would in time become a thriving city. A great line of walls and fortifications were erected at his behest to stand against the Mulgur threat. The Shield of Thrace. The protected people of Cilicia thrived and multiplied. The Cilicians demonstrated as much ingenuity as faith, as they had mastered the forging of iron, and in small quantities the precious steel by which the blades of the priests' chosen warriors carried the Creator's strength. The Cilicians innovated the recurved longbow, a far deadlier weapon than the short hunting bows used at that time. So armed and encased in metal armor, they proved their superiority against the spears, short blades, axes, and hides of the Mulgur tribes. Even more important was their discipline and tactics, as well as the support of leading Mennite priests who spoke prayers to set the followers of the worm ablaze. In 2230 BR, the man who would eventually become priest king Golovant was born. On his maturity, he rose to prominence, proving blessings of the lawgiver, and by his rule, the kingdom of Cilicia began to repay the Mulgur for 1,000 years of bloody conflict. The effectiveness of his forays west of the Shield of Thrace to track down Mulgur tribes and burn their villages did not go unnoticed, and in time the Mulgur stirred to retaliate. A champion rose among the Mulgur tribe, a great Trollkin chieftain by the name of Hufar Grim, who gathered a vast horde with the cause of breaking through the Mennite walls to burn Cilicia to the ground. Grimmer was determined to show the valley-fed and teeming humans the might of the Mulgur, and brought together the strength of their varied tribes. Bringing dozens of Krells of his own people, Grimmer also marched along Orgrun, Bogren, and barbaric humans. Each of these races brought their own skills in combat as well as their courage, united by their worship of the worm and their desire to see Cilicia destroyed. A great battle took place at the Shield of Thrace, with the fate of Western Immoren in the balance. The Mulgur crashed into the walls in waves, heedless of their losses, while archers on the walls rained down arrows on their ranks and poured hot oil down upon them. The Mulgur ignored their losses and threw carved logs against the walls to climb up them as ladders to fight on the battlements, and for a time succeeded in overwhelming the defenders. Golovant led the armies of Cilicia to confront the foe, and brought him the very fire of Menoth and an imperishable will. Golovant and Grimmer fought several times, and in these battles the Mennonites eventually gained the upper hand. Golovant led his people in pushing the Mulgore back and regained the battlements. Hofar Grimmer was captured and presented to the remaining barbarians in a grisly spectacle as he was tortured and executed. While Grimmer continued to shout defiance until his dying breath, the Mulgore lost their will to fight and scattered into the mountains. Golovant was not inclined to allow them to lick their wounds, and so set forth with his armies on a 10-year campaign to end the Mulgore. Remnants of the savage tribes scattered, most going north to the settlements in the far frozen mountains, while others went west to hide amongst the Shard Islands. The barbaric peoples who worshipped the worm would continue to plague the civilized settlements for thousands of years, but never again as a unified people. After Golovant's death, his son was slain by rivals, and Calacia, fragmented as factions, sought control of the river valleys. However, in 2051 BR, Golovant's grandson succeeded in uniting the region once more. He renamed the capital Caspia, and under his direction, massive fortifications and walls were erected, all consecrated to Menoth. In subsequent generations, it became known as the City of Walls. Addendum: the fall of the Mulgore and the Duenian races. The scattering of the Mulgore was necessary for the rise of human civilization, but it had an impact on other races that had joined in the tribal alliance. While humans could convert to Menoth, the Orgron, Trollkin, Gobbers, and Bogren were not given the choice. Members of these races were often slaughtered indiscriminately or driven out. In the wake of extensive persecution by Menite crusades, these races dwindled and turned inward to surviving in communities in remote and inhospitable places. One of the largest impacts of the fall of the Mulgore was the widespread abandonment of the worship of the worm among these races. Though they knew the worm would be their divine father, this entity had become tainted by death and destruction. This led to the increase of Duenian worship, as these persecuted races turned to their divine mother who offered fertility to replace the slain. End addendum. The Kardovic and the North. Even as Galavant lay dying, a fierce warrior priest named Kardovic was attempting to unite his people in the north. Gef's successors had come to this reason to spread the word of Menoth, and their lessons took root amongst the mighty horse lords who warred with one another across the plains south of the three Great Lakes. They adopted the written alphabet to suit the local tongue, which would become known as Kurzvik, which would become in time giving rise to the more predominant of the Norman languages. A warrior sect of the northern Menites fiercely guarded the knowledge they had inherited, having translated the text of the true law into Kurzvik. Kardovic was the most prominent warlord of these people. Kardovic was described as a giant of a man, fierce and proud and fanatically pious. Kardovic felt the calling to unite this region by blood and iron. It is said that the crossroads in those days were decorated with pikes suspending the heads of countless of his enemies, those who deemed too wild or irredeemable to convert. Like Golovant in the south, Kardovic was filled with the pious compulsion to rid his lands of worm-worshipping savages. Kardovic's campaign against those he saw to be in league with the worm were brutal and effective, going directly to the shamans and confronting them. Slaughtering shamans of the worm proved highly effective, as many of the survivors immediately converted to the Menite faith. Priests followed behind Kardovic to bring the gentler teachings of the law to the remnants of the defeated tribes. By the time of his death, Kardovic had converted over 1 million savages to the lawgiver, spreading Menite worship across the great north of what would one day be Cador. Some mountain tribes remained beyond his reach, but he ensured the Menite faith took root across the land. The people who inherited the legacy of Kardovic persist to this day, and all those who call themselves Cards believe they have some connection to the chosen people who gathered around Kardovic. Nearly every noble family in modern Cador claims descent from the vast family tree of Kardovic. These crusades also spread the Kurzic language and gave rise to lasting settlements. While the North would be caught up in turmoil and warfare throughout the next era, the leaders built walls around their towns, with impressive Menite temples at their centers. Some claim that the wild northern lands never fully embraced Menite teachings, adopting them from fear instead of belief. It is true that the totems endured, as did many superstitions in the remote reaches. The far northern Rostov, Vindol, and Vogoy peoples never abandoned their beliefs, albeit in some cases old rites were changed and disguised. Elsewhere, the fruits of civilization were enjoyed by brutal tyrants who sought to protect their holdings they seized through conquest. Little regard was given to the suffering of the peasants who toiled in the fields, labored in mines and quarries, and who worked like slaves to erect temples and fortresses.